The Insanity of God, a true story of faith resurrected. Nick Ripken with Greg Lewis. Chapter 1, Descent into Hell. Our flight path that day took us away from the fertile green Nairobi hills, described so idyllically in the novel Out of Africa, across the parched brown terrain of northeast Kenya, and then over the forbidding mountains and desolate desert of southern Ethiopia. We finally dropped out of the sky and descended into hell by way of a bombed-out single landing strip airport on the dusty outskirts of a city called Hargeisa. This was the regional capital of an area known in colonial days as British Somaliland. Just a few years earlier, the region had declared its independence and attempted to secede from the Somali Democratic Republic. That had prompted the embattled Somali president to order his air force to bomb the second largest city of his own country into submission. Within minutes of my arrival there, I was aware that I had never been, or even imagined, any place that felt as oppressed as this. Rough patches on the recently repaired runway covered only the biggest cracks and craters. Every man I saw working or walking around the airport carried an automatic weapon. Next to a nearby storage shed, I saw women and children poking wearily through piles of refuse in search of food. Inside the shed, which was covered by a bomb-damaged roof and enclosed on only 3 sides, 2 Somali guards napped atop stacked cases of hand grenades, AK-47s, rocket grenades, landmines, and assorted other ordnance and ammunition. That one cache of weaponry, probably 60 feet wide, 15 feet deep, and piled 10 feet high, looked to my untrained eyes to hold enough firepower to overthrow a good-sized developing country. And perhaps it would, one day, do just that. Once arrangements were made for a private car to taxi me to Hargeisa, I thanked the Red Cross crew for the lift. The pilot reminded me that it might be anywhere from a week to a month before he returned. He said that he would try to get word to the airport before he did. I couldn't begin to comprehend the devastation that I had encountered traveling from the airport into the city that day. What should have been a quick 5-kilometer jaunt turned into a long and disturbing drive through utter destruction. If I had ever needed a visual image to illustrate the term war-torn, that picture popped up everywhere I looked. The few individuals I spotted on the streets seemed to be wandering more than walking. They were people who seemed to be going through the motions of life with little hope, uncertain purpose, and no real destination. My driver told me that 70,000 people still called this tortured city home. I also learned that in all of Hargeisa, only 7 houses still had intact roofs. The worst of the fighting in this Somaliland region of the country had ended many months earlier. Once the bombing runs had halted, a relentless follow-up mortar and rocket grenade assault on the city began. With that punishment inflicted, the loyal government troops had turned their attention southward again to continue their battle with the rebel clan's militia for control of Mogadishu and the rest of the country. The southern clan's insurrection eventually succeeded, and the longtime dictator fled into exile. Soon the rebel coalition fell apart, and the former allies turned their violence against each other to determine which factions might be strong enough to seize ultimate control and govern the country. The worst of the warfare may have moved elsewhere, but the death and the destruction wrought for years on Hargeisas remained. As my driver carefully picked his way, detouring around rubble from collapsed buildings and dodging bomb craters in the road, I was told that the local people were still finding as many as 50 landmines a day. Many of the explosives were discovered only when stepped on and triggered accidentally by animals or playing children. This was Somaliland in early 1992, a land tormented by a deadly and unprecedented drought. Even worse, this horrific natural disaster had come hard on the heels of a brutal civil war as violent and inhumane as any conflict in human history. Yet, tragically, there would still be many more months and countless more deaths before this crippled country's full measure of misery would finally register on the radar screen of world awareness and shock the international community into responding. I didn't know a soul in Somaliland the day that I landed in Hargeisa. An acquaintance who had worked in the country before the Civil War somehow made contact on my behalf with a friend of his, a young European man currently working with a German nurse and a Dutch woman who had run an orphanage in Hargeisa for years. Those were the only contacts I had in the entire city. Fortunately, my driver just happened to know where to find the Westerners who ran the orphanage. They graciously invited me into their home, my base of operations, for as long as I was in Somaliland. The three of them lived very simply in the undamaged rooms of an empty shell of a rented house a few blocks from the orphanage that housed about 30 children whom they cared for with the help of a few Somali staff. With no electricity, no running water, and no Western furniture in their home, my hosts used a small charcoal stove to prepare a supper consisting of chewy bits of goat simmered in broth and served with potatoes and boiled greens. We sat on the floor to share my first meal in Somaliland, and we remained in that same position for a long after dinner conversation. As they told me about their challenges at the orphanage and talked about the children that they worked with, I was moved by their passion and compassion, not just for the girls and boys in their care, but for all of the desperate people of Somaliland, old or young, who had suffered so much for so long. Naturally, my hosts wanted to know about me, especially why I had come to Hargeisa and what I hoped to accomplish. I told them about Ruth and my boys back in Nairobi, and then shared some of my personal background growing up on a farm in middle America, being the second in my family to get a college education, serving as a pastor at a couple of small churches back home, coming to Africa 7 years before and working until recently in two different African countries, planting and growing churches. I saw concern as well as interest on the faces of my listeners. I quickly let them know that I understood that I would probably never be able to do in Somaliland the kind of work that I had done previously in Malawi and South Africa. Strict regulations had made it extremely difficult for Westerners of any kind of religious affiliation to live or even gain entry into the country. Now, in the wake of the recent civil war, it had become virtually impossible. According to my research, the best estimates indicated that in the entire nation of Somaliland, with a population of 7 million people, there were only enough followers of Jesus to perhaps fill the pews of one small country church like we had had back home in Kentucky. Of course, there was not a single church or enough believers concentrated in one area of Somaliland to form even a small house church congregation. In light of that, I assured my host that Ruth and I were representing several different secular organizations that were interested in providing much needed relief work in Somaliland. Naturally, as believers ourselves, we hoped that our humanitarian relief efforts might demonstrate the love of God as we tried to be obedient to Jesus' teaching that his followers should seek out the least of these. We wanted to obey his call to give water to the thirsty and food to the hungry, to clothe the naked, to provide shelter for the homeless and lost, to care for the sick, to visit those who had lost their freedom. Like the Good Samaritan in Jesus' parable, we wanted to bind up the wounds and generously provide for the needs of any one of our neighbors in need of help. Even at this early stage, we were well aware that the forms of Christianity, such as buildings, ordained clergy, and seminaries, were not transferable into hostile environments such as Somaliland. Words like church, missionary, and Christian were just a few of the words that would harm witness or hinder work within an environment such as this. If my 3 dinner partners had written me off as naive American, they would have been right. But they listened graciously and assured me that once I had begun scouting around Hargeisa, I would have no trouble at all finding a multitude of neighbors with more needs than I could ever imagine. Later that night, laying on top of a sleeping bag spread out on a concrete floor, I mentally reviewed all that I had seen and heard and learned in just a few hours. I was already experiencing sensory overload, and I was certain that I had only started to scratch the surface. In that moment, the prayer that I prayed was mostly complaint. Lord God, why me? Why here? Just in case God had forgotten, I pointed out that nothing in my upbringing, my education, or my professional experience had equipped me to live or work in a place like Somaliland. My prayer that night was filled with demands. What in the world do you expect me to do here, Lord? There are no churches and hardly any Somali believers. There are no pastors, no deacons, no elders, no Sunday schools, and no Bible studies. There is nothing here that I recognize. There is nothing that I know how to do here. I am hopelessly lost. I am all alone behind enemy lines. Please, Jesus, get me out of here. Forget the months of planning and preparation that had preceded this trip. If there had been a way to contact my Red Cross pilot and persuade him to fly back the next day, I was ready to climb on the plane and never return to Somaliland. My visit to the orphanage the next day lifted my spirits, despite the fact that getting there was another harrowing adventure. It was difficult and dangerous for everyone to move around Hargeisa. What should have been an 8-block walk that took a few minutes wasn't that simple, and it certainly wasn't safe. I followed my host's lead as we trod carefully down deserted alleys and detoured completely around other blocks where they knew the streets had been mined and not yet cleared. By the time we reached our destination, I felt as if I had walked to the end of the world. The orphanage, however, felt like an oasis of joy and hope in a vast desert of despair. The kids crowded into a little compound where the kids crowded into that little compound were some of the best fed Somali children I would ever see. The home itself showed the Arab architectural influence common to many cities in the Horn of Africa. A single-story, flat-roofed structure, its walls constructed of sun-baked bricks covered in plaster and whitewashed inside and out. Sunlight shone in through bar-covered window openings, none of which was screened or glassed. The outer walls of the house were pocked with bullet holes. At night, the children slept wall to wall on woven mats they rolled out over cement floors. Like the rest of Hargeisa's residents, the residents of the orphanage lived without electricity, except when petrol could be found for a small generator to power a handful of lights. Without running water, orphanage workers had to search each day for new sources of water that they could afford to purchase. The only toilets consisted of a simple hole in the floor or ground over dug out latrine pits. Not one time in my visit that day, nor in any other visit to the orphanage, did I see a child set foot outside of the walls of the orphanage. Their entire world had been reduced to that one small compound consisting of the interior of that house and its tiny courtyard. Theirs was a world without toys. There were few books, and no modern appliances, and no pieces of furniture. Yet, despite such primitive conditions, the contrast between inside and outside could not have been greater. Beyond those walls, I had witnessed the hideous face of evil and its crushing impact on the country. Within the shelter of the home, however, I discovered a surprisingly secure and happy refuge where children smiled and laughed and played. My first attempt at scouting came later that day. It was nothing more than a simple trek with the orphanage ladies on their daily walk to the city's open air market to see what food might be available for the children's supper. I asked if I could tag along. I figured that if my organization was going to provide the orphanage with food and other relief assistance, I needed to have some firsthand knowledge about what was currently available from local sources. The short answer to this question was not much. The only meat for sale was goat or camel, and there was no sure way to tell whether the meat had been intentionally slaughtered to be sold at market that day, or if a local farmer had simply tried to make the best of a bad situation by carving up the carcass after one of the emaciated animals in his herd had dropped dead of thirst or disease, or maybe wandered accidentally into a landmine. None of the meat for sale that day would come close to qualifying as prime. But I had seen my share of animals slaughtered back home on the farm, so I wasn't too squeamish about the skinned and dressed sides and quarters of raw meat hanging from the top of the butcher's stalls. Once the ladies made their choice and pointed to what looked like a whole goat, I did have to wince and swallow hard when the butcher gave the carcass a good whack with the flat side of his machete blade to chase a cloud of flies away before sawing off one scrawny leg of goat. The orphanage children would each get barely one bite of meat from that single goat leg. But there might be enough to flavor a small sack of scrawny potatoes that another vendor had for sale, along with some onions and two undersized shriveled heads of cabbage. Those were the groceries we bought, simply because that was all anybody had for sale. Later, I was able to explore some other parts of the city. What struck me most was not what I saw, but what I did not see. For example, nowhere in the city of 70,000 people did I find a single functioning school, nor did I find any hospital seeking to provide care for the many children dying of disease and starvation. Everywhere my friends took me, their tour guide spiel sounded sadly the same. A school used to be there. That building over there used to be a hospital. This was where the police station was. A store used to be here. A sports field used to be there. As I listened to this repeated refrain, I asked myself, in a place where so many of the things basic to life have to be spoken of in the past tense, is there any hope to turn things around and get to the future tense? Chapter 2: Growing Up Country. Today, looking back on that first trip to Somaliland, I often wonder, what in the world was I thinking? In many ways, the experience seems just as surreal to me now as it did at the time. There was nothing in my rural Kentucky background that would have hinted at a life of international travel and hair-raising danger. I was the second oldest of seven children. My family heritage provided me little in the way of privilege. Before I left home at the age of 18, I had traveled outside of Kentucky one time. Our family was both poor and proud. My parents instilled in their children a strong sense of family loyalty, a solid foundation of integrity and personal responsibility, a determined self sufficiency, and a strong work ethic. Looking back, I don't know whether I would claim to have had a particularly happy or unhappy childhood. Mostly, I worked hard and kept busy. I didn't have much time to think about whether I was happy or not. From my parents and my neighbors, I learned that life is hard work and that happiness is being with family and friends. Those simple lessons have served me well over the years. No one in my family had ever been to college before my brother and I went. My dad earned his living in the construction business. My mom was a housewife, which meant she was also a butcher, baker, candlestick maker, and much more. On weeknights and on weekends, our family farmed a nearby piece of land, and there was never an end to the work. I spent weeks at a time living with and helping out my maternal grandparents, who were themselves poor, lifelong tenant farmers. They had moved from place to place, working the fields, caring for livestock, and tending the land of various absentee property owners. Typically, I would be up at 4 o'clock most mornings to help with the daily chores, which often included milking 20 cows by hand. Breakfast would be on the table before 6. After breakfast, I caught the bus at the start of its long, meandering 2 hour route to school. I would be in class all day, then get back to the bus for the 2 hour odyssey back through the countryside to whatever place my grandparents were farming at the time. We would eat supper and head to bed early in hopes of getting enough sleep to rise long before dawn and go through the same routine the next day. There simply wasn't enough time or opportunity to get into too much trouble with a schedule like that. We got more than enough exercise working, but for fun and recreation, my brothers and I played Little League Baseball in the summertime. And of course, growing up in the bluegrass state, every kid old enough to dribble or drool followed the exploits of University of Kentucky Wildcats and their legendary basketball coach Adolph Rupp on the radio all winter. Many people in Kentucky ascribe divine status to Coach Rupp. Speaking of God, the good people of my community did so often. Many of them seemed to be on a first name basis with him. However, I have to confess that the Lord's name probably came up a lot less frequently and occasionally less reverently in my household than it did in the homes of many of our neighbors. My parents weren't much in the way of churchgoers. The best chance of catching them in a pew would be Christmas Sunday or maybe Easter, and whenever their children had a part in a play or program. To their credit, my mother and father took my siblings and me to church often, getting us up early and dressed in our best clothes to be driven and dropped off for Sunday school and worship. I suspect that my parents' faithfulness in getting us to church every Sunday may not have been as motivated by their concern of our spiritual nourishment and training as it was by the appeal of free babysitting and the promise of 2 hours of weekly freedom from their own parental responsibilities. Spiritual instruction at home was limited to an annual reading of the biblical account of the Christmas story, and my dad's occasional verbalized critiques of the sins and shortcomings of the good church people he knew, as if he wanted to convince us, and maybe himself, that our family was as good as anyone in town, maybe better, and, without a doubt in his mind, certainly less hypocritical. I actually liked going to church to see my school friends in Sunday school. I even enjoyed Sunday morning worship. I especially loved the church choir music. It prompted my very first sense of awe. Church felt so different from any other part of my life, usually in a good way. But that also meant that church and real life seemed to have little in common. I tried to listen carefully to the sermons, but I usually failed unless the preacher told a good story. My least favorite part of church took place during the closing hymn. At the end of every service, any good preacher worth his salt would give the recipient the requisite altar call. Just when a young boy's restless feet were itching to get on with other things, just when I would begin to salivate over thoughts of Sunday dinner, just when everything seemed to be winding down to a merciful and humane conclusion, the service would inevitably grind to an abrupt, albeit predictable halt. The worst part was not ever knowing how long this pastoral appeal might last. It also felt like a dangerous time because these appeals could sometimes feel terribly personal. One Sunday afternoon after worship, my older brother and I were at home getting changed for an afternoon of Sunday fun. My brother took an unusually serious tone with me to say, "Nick, I think it's time you got saved." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. He saw my puzzled look. He explained, "We were talking about this in my Sunday school class today, and I have been thinking that you're old enough to know what it means to get saved. So next week, at the end of church, when the preacher asks people to go down to the altar, you need to go, Nick. And then just tell the preacher why you're there, okay?" I nodded in reply, but I didn't completely understand what my brother meant. I was 7 years old. The following Sunday, as the preacher gave the invitation during the closing hymn, my brother nudged me. I then glanced up at him. He motioned toward the front of the church. I wasn't at all sure I was ready for this, whatever this was, but I didn't want to disappoint my big brother. So I stepped out of the pew and began walking very slowly down to the front of the sanctuary. The preacher met me at the altar and bent over to ask me why I had come forward. I said, "My brother told me to." The pastor got a funny look on his face and told me that we would talk after he dismissed service. I can't say I remember much about the conversation we had had in his office that day, except that he started by asking me a question that I wasn't sure how to answer. Then he asked me another question, obviously looking for some different response that I didn't know how to give him. Confused and embarrassed, I quickly dissolved into tears, and that effectively ended our little talk about my spiritual condition. Some years later, I learned that he had called my mother later that week to tell her what had happened. "I'm not at all sure that Nick really understands the concept of salvation," he said, "or what it means to be saved from our sins. But I'm a little afraid that if we don't go ahead and baptize him, we might set him back in his faith." For that reason, I was baptized the very next Sunday. That service was more memorable because of the coldness of the baptismal water than because of any real meaning or significance the experience held for me at the time. The first truly significant and personal spiritual experience I had in church didn't occur until 4 years later. It was Easter Sunday. I was 11. I remember the details vividly. The church was already packed by the time we got there. Our regular pew was already full. In fact, the church was so full that our family had to split up. I slipped into a single spot in a pew near the front. Perhaps it was the different from usual feel to the experience that made me somehow more attentive to my environment that morning. I remember it being a sparkling day. The sun shone extra bright outside, making the stained glass windows of the sanctuary glow with a deeper, richer color than I had ever noticed before. The congregation sang with more gusto than normal, and when the choir sang their especially triumphant anthem, I could feel my inner spirit soaring with them. And the unusual and powerful feeling I was experiencing in church that morning didn't even stop when the pastor stood and began to preach. As he recounted what should have been a familiar story of all that had happened to Jesus at the end of his life on earth, I found myself drawn into the story. I absorbed the pastor's words like background narration. like actually seeing in my mind and feeling in my heart all that took place with Jesus and his disciples during the Holy Passover week. I sensed the love and the closeness between Jesus and his disciples at the Last Supper. I felt the sadness and disappointment, grief and fear in the garden. I felt genuine outrage at the mistreatment of Jesus in the course of his trial and his execution. I desperately wanted to do something or see God do something to make it all right. For the first time, I understood something of the price that Jesus paid for the sins of the world and for me. I could imagine the deep despair that the disciples must have felt after he died and his body was placed in a tomb. What a dark day that Saturday must have been. When the preacher finally got to the Easter morning part of the story, the part where the rolled away stone, the angel, the empty tomb, and the resurrection of Jesus, something deep inside of me wanted to shout right out loud, "Hooray!" I felt like breaking into song just like the crowds in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. As I tried to imagine what would happen if I actually did that, I quickly glanced around at the people around me. Other children were drawing or writing on their bulletins. Some fidgeted, others stared blankly, deep into their private daydreams. The majority of the adults that I could see seemed to be sitting and listening intently enough, looking and acting no different from any other Sunday during any other sermon. I felt like shouting, "Hey everyone, are you listening to this?" I had sat around some of those same folks at football games where they would yell and scream. How in the world was it that these people managed to get so much more excited about what happened at a high school football field on Friday nights than they did about the resurrection of Jesus at church on Easter Sunday morning? That didn't compute to my 11-year-old mind. I simply could not fathom how it was that nobody cared enough to be truly celebrating this incredible story of Jesus' death and resurrection that we were hearing. Unless the very thought quickly and completely squelched the spirit that I had been feeling that morning. Unless the reason that the people sitting around me in church that Sunday were not getting excited about the Easter story was because they had heard the story so many times before. Maybe they had heard the story so many times before that now they saw it as just a story. I am sure that they believed that it was the truth, but it was truth that had very little to do with real life. Evidently, it was a story that did not demand much excitement or response. Evidently, it was just another good story. Maybe even a great story, which I needed to relegate to my once upon a time file along with a lot of other entertaining or inspiring tales I had heard at other times. When I walked out of that Easter Sunday service that morning, that is exactly what I did. I mentally filed the resurrection story away as interesting. For the next 7 years of my life, I found little about the Bible, church, or the Christian faith that excited my spirit again.